those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris Reinhardt. I am the Dean of Students here at Richmond High School. Ms. Borwick is back there. She's the Dean of Students at Richmond Middle School. The principal, Keith Bartels, is also in the back. I'd like to thank Becky Borwick for setting up this presentation. We are seeing a lot of issues in Richmond High School and Richmond Middle School with vaping. This is not just something that we're seeing in Richmond. I'm talking to my colleagues, some of my colleagues, and they're seeing the same things in school districts in the area. So Ms. Borwick and I thought it would be important to bring someone in to educate parents, community members about vaping so that you would recognize it when you see it and you could do something about it yourselves. So I would like to introduce to you Corey Beckwith. He is a public health coordinator from Access Community Health and Research Center. Corey Beckwith.
All right, hi everybody, Corey. It's really nice to be here. I talked to, I think, most of the students at from 7 to 12 earlier today. That was really nice. I think they had a fairly positive reaction to the presentation, which is, I think, sometimes the best you can hope for with this type of thing in students. But it really is nice to be able to come out and not just talk to the students, but also talk to parents. I don't typically have that opportunity, and if you're getting the message to the kids and not to the parents, you're really missing an important part of the equation. So I'm very glad to be here with you. Did anybody get caught in that little 10-minute squall there? Yeah, I couldn't believe it. I was over at the library and I just drove around the corner and I could only see one car in front of me. But it appears to be past us now. So thank you for braving the weather. Up here, and I should tell you, I suppose, for the last 10 years I've worked in the substance abuse and tobacco prevention field. And a lot of things have changed in that time, but maybe more than anything else is tobacco and sort of the trends that have come and gone in the last 10 years. Vaping was basically it had been invented in China, and it was just starting to get introduced here in the United States. It wasn't really until about 5 years ago that it really took off. And in that 5 short years, we've really seen it kind of balloon. We're going to look at some numbers in a minute. I've got this little image here, and it's a few years old, 2013, right as this problem was starting to kind of take hold. And it's a bit dated, but I keep it up there because it, I think, speaks to the real concern when it comes to vaping. So 250,000 middle and high school students who never smoked regular cigarettes used e-cigarettes in 2013. So 250,000 teens who weren't smokers, and based on the teen smoking rates lately, which are extremely low, probably would not have become smokers, but they were exposing themselves to nicotine through these products. And that's the real concern. You probably all know somebody who is an adult, that's a smoker, who's maybe switched to vaping, and that might be good for them, but that's really a separate conversation. We're talking about young people who aren't smokers, who aren't exposed to any of those chemicals, and now, because of these new products, they're being lured back into tobacco. So I apologize, no clicker, so I'm going to be walking over to the computer periodically, but don't mind me. All right. Incidentally, this is not a huge group. If you have any questions, please, by all means, just go for it, and we should be able to get to everything. Up here, we've got the CDC's Youth Tobacco Survey that they do, nationwide thing each year. 2017 isn't available yet. So we've got 2013 to 2016, And the real takeaway here is that if we look at cigarettes and then e-cigarettes, and incidentally, a lot of stuff is sort of reported as e-cigarettes. We don't really use that term too much anymore, and certainly, kids don't. But if it says e-cigarettes, we're just talking about vaping, different terms. But you can see in the green, basically 2013 is the blue, 2014 is the green, and between those 2 years, the numbers flipped. In 2014, more teens, more high school students were vaping than smoking regular cigarettes. And that's 2013, only really 4 or 5 years after these products were even available in the United States. That's a very fast turnaround. The rate of teen cigarette smoking has been dropping, but the vaping rate has really jumped up quickly. And you can see in 2016, there's a drop off from the previous year, which is encouraging. But even though this particular study hasn't released their data for 2017, what we've seen in other, similar nationwide studies is that rate went right back up. So it's not, vaping isn't on its way down. That was just a little, a little correction from the, very high rate the year before. It's not at all a flash in the pan thing that's going to be, out of here in a few months. It looks like it's growing and growing and becoming more of an issue. So we have hookah on there. Just to give you a little background, Access, the organization I work for, we have an office here in Macomb, down in Sterling Heights, and then in Dearborn's our main offices, and that's where I spend most of my week. So we are one of the oldest Arab American nonprofit organizations in the country, and for many years we did a lot of work focused on the hookah because that was so prevalent in the Arab American community. When vaping started becoming more of an issue, I got a lot of calls, asking if I, would come and speak about that, because we did a lot of stuff around hookah, and people just sort of associated these other forms of tobacco together, and that's how I got involved with this. But as you can see, hookah had a little kind of brief shoot up in popularity, but it's really dropped off. The big focus now is very much on vaping. So I always like to talk a little bit about the reasons that teens give for why they vape. I think it's important when we're talking about any substance, not just tobacco products, but alcohol, marijuana, you name it, thinking about why people do it. Working in prevention, we need to know the reasons that people get involved with it if we want to figure out ways to, help, prevent people from, making that same choice. And the University of Michigan every year does a study called Monitoring the Future. It's a great study. It's nationwide. They ask teens about drug, alcohol, and tobacco use. And one of the questions they started asking teens who vape is, why do you choose to do it? And the answers they gave, to see what it's like, because it tastes good, because they're bored, because of stress, to do something with their friends. Aside from the taste, these are the same reasons teens give for why they smoke regular cigarettes. So I think sometimes there's a temptation to kind of look at vaping and cigarette smoking as sort of two very different types of activities. But the reality is, for teens, the things that bring them to it, the reasons behind vaping, are very much the same. And in a way, that's it's reassuring. because we've had a lot of success over the last 20 plus years bringing down the youth smoking rate. So if we know that the reasons teens are vaping are similar to the reasons that they're smoking cigarettes, some of the same strategies for reducing teen use should work. And I should point out, what you see on this list is what the teens themselves report. So nobody's going to say, I'm doing this because I think other people will think I look cool, or I'm doing this because a bunch of other people are doing it and I want to fit in with them. But in reality, we know that that's also a big part of it. So the way these work, and I should tell you, we're going to get into some of the regulations around these products in a little bit, but these, the e-liquids, so the actual liquid that gets heated up, the devices themselves, these are all classified as tobacco products, because most of these products contain nicotine, and the nicotine is extracted from tobacco, then mixed with some other chemicals. So as far as like the FDA is concerned, these products are classified as tobacco. That means that the age for purchasing is 18, but it's important that everybody's aware that's a federal law, and the FDA has some enforcement abilities, but they are more likely to respond to a report of a specific business selling to minors or other violations. It's not like the local police force who might issue tickets to minors who are caught vaping. I don't know about Richmond. Some communities in Michigan have ordinances that set the age at 18, but there isn't a state law. So in communities where there's no city municipal ordinance, typically local police aren't writing tickets or giving citations. And I apologize, I should have looked that up before I came. But basically, these things all work pretty much the same. I've got a bunch here you can check out afterwards. I'll just use one of these as a display. They're in bags because when the liquid leaks, the nicotine absorbs into your skin, very quickly. I've been doing a presentation and grabbed one of these that was, kind of covered with the liquid, and about 5 minutes later, my heart was racing, and I started to sweat and feel disoriented. It really doesn't take much nicotine to cause that sort of reaction, because when it comes to cigarettes, you're not going to get enough nicotine to for it to be toxic, basically. But with these liquids, you have this concentrated nicotine, and it can absorb through your skin in just a minute. So just something to keep in mind if you ever find any of these around. You may want to kind of find a rubber glove or something, because if it's covered with that those e-liquids, it's not good for you. But anyways, you have a device like this. You might have something kind of like we see on the screen. You might have something like this here. They all look pretty different, but the way they work is basically the same. So they'll all have some sort of mouthpiece where you put your mouth, or what I say to the students is maybe you pass it around to 5 people and everyone puts their mouth on it. As we know that certainly does happen. But you have the mouthpiece there, and then there's going to be some sort of tank or cartridge that's filled up with the e-liquid, the stuff that actually gets heated up and inhaled. On this device, it's refillable, so you would just screw the top off and take one of these bottles that we have up here and fill it up yourself. Some devices come with pre-filled cartridges, but no matter how that's set up, right next to that tank is going to be the atomizer, which is the heating element. It happens to be stuck in this one right now, but the metal part on the end is what actually heats up. And you see, when you check some of these out later, you'll be able to tell they have little wicks running out of them, and those wicks absorb the liquid. They draw it into the heating element, and you have the battery here, which is the big part of any of these devices. And when you either press a button or inhale, it activates the battery, which heats up the atomizer and causes the liquid to turn into, it's actually not a vapor technically, it's an aerosol, so a suspension of liquid molecules, but that's what you inhale. And whether you're looking at a more complicated device or something very simple, they all basically do the same thing. So different types of these devices, you may have seen some things like this before. All of the stuff up there, it's out there, but it's not what teens are likely to be using. These are some of the older generation devices, or just some of the the bigger, heavier pieces of equipment are not what a teen who's trying to conceal their vaping is likely to use. And I know from talking to the staff here and also a lot of other schools that the devices they're finding on students more often than not are more similar to the things up on the screen here. There's a very popular product called the Jewel. I don't think this has any stuff on it, so I'll check it out. So, small, kind of looks like a USB drive. There's a small USB charger that hooks to the bottom. It's magnetic, so it just connects to it, and you plug it into a computer or a charger. These are obviously very small, easy to conceal. They're about $35, and they take these cartridges, which are the rough equivalent of a pack of cigarettes as far as how long they last, and they run about $5 a piece. They come in packs of 4. So these are pretty popular. Also, and I know that they've seen quite a few here at the high school of devices like this. And you can check it out later, but it's very thin. You could almost fit it in a wallet. It's kind of that small. This product is called Soren Air. Unlike the Jewel, this is refillable. So you would take the top off, fill it with one of these liquids, and then there's a small hole on the end. You just put your mouth to it and inhale, and that activates the battery, and it produces the vapor. There's also right here. I apologize. It's not to scale, but about the same size as one of these. This is the new version of the Soren Air, Soren Drop. I know these are becoming very popular at some of the other schools in the district. I know Mr. Reinhardt mentioned he'd seen some of these as well. These are all pretty inexpensive. The sort of rectangle model is about $20. The teardrop shape is around $30. And the liquids themselves, they can range depending on the size of the bottle and the brand from like $7 to $20. It's a pretty broad range, and there are some that are cheaper than that. So and that does last a while, even if you're using it pretty heavily. Depending on how you use these products, they can be more cost-effective than cigarettes, which for teens is usually a consideration. But yeah, and you can see we're going to look at some more sort of advertising and marketing in a bit, but there's an ad up in the top right, and obviously kind of targeted towards a younger demographic. So the Juul, I highlight it because it's been the last couple of years a pretty popular model. So these devices, like I said, have a pre-filled cartridge that you pop into the top. They all contain nicotine, so the cartridges don't come without nicotine. Some of these products you might find labeled zero nicotine. I don't think any of these ones are, but they do exist. With this particular product, that's not an option. And the Truth Initiative, which is the organization that does a lot of the anti-tobacco ads you see on TV, like where they're talking to big groups of people on the street and that sort of thing, they did a study last year where they talked to teen and young adult Juul users. And they found that 37%, so over a third of the people they talked to didn't know that they were inhaling nicotine when they were using that product. They just assumed there wasn't any in there. I thought this was interesting. A quarter of the people they surveyed they said that they didn't vape when asked, that they Juuled. And I've actually heard that from a number of schools, that students will refer to it that way. And it matters because when we think about how we talk to students, if we have a young person who's in that 25%, and you ask them, are you vaping? They might respond no, when in fact they're doing it, but they think of it in different terms. So it's really important to have a conversation beyond just sort of the yes and no. That's just one product, but it is a pretty major part of the youth vaping landscape. So what all these products have in common is you're heating up that e-liquid and inhaling it. So it's worth talking about what's actually in there. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. I know, pretty often I'll hear from, not just from students, but from adults too, isn't it just water in there? Isn't it just juice? And no, it's not. It's very far from that. But I can understand why somebody would feel that way. If you take a cigarette and they're smoking a cigarette, it smells like a cigarette does. It's pretty obviously, it doesn't smell like something that's good for you, basically. And these products have a fruity smell. They come in fruit, candy flavors. It doesn't necessarily seem like something that would be bad at all. And I understand why people, would feel that way. It's just, that's why it's important that we educate folks. So what's actually in that stuff? Nicotine is really the most important ingredient to mention. I said before there's some nicotine-free varieties, but when the FDA started testing these products a couple of years ago, they're kind of gradually starting to regulate them. They found that 2/3 of the products that were labeled nicotine-free actually contained nicotine. So most people who were vaping what they thought was without nicotine were actually, getting it every time they vape. So you have folks who are ending up getting addicted who didn't think that they were using nicotine at all. But when we're talking about young people, this is, typically an introduction to nicotine. So it's not, youth cigarette smokers who are trying this out. There's not that many youth cigarette smokers left, which, that's a good thing. But when we're talking about vaping, it really is, for the most part, young people who are, for the first time, exposing themselves to nicotine through these products. And they don't always realize that they're doing that, but they are. So the nicotine in a vape is no different than the nicotine in a cigarette. Depending on the concentration that a person is using and how they vape, most people don't do it the same way you might smoke a cigarette, where they're vaping for a few minutes and then they put it out. It's something that could be kind of more gradual throughout the day. Some folks are getting less nicotine than they would as a regular cigarette smoker. Some people are getting more. It's highly variable in a way that cigarettes really aren't. It's not just nicotine that's in these products. That liquid itself is made up of a couple different chemicals. There's propylene glycol, which is the stuff that they put in a smoke machine. And it makes sense because you look at the fog rolling out of a smoke machine and you look at somebody vaping and it looks very similar. Because it is, it's the same stuff. But in these e-liquids, there's other ingredients added in. There's vegetable glycerin, so that's just sort of like thick, slippery sort of liquid, and that thickens up this mixture, which is important because if you were just to pour some water into one of these, it doesn't really work. It doesn't produce that effect. By thickening up that liquid, it changes the way that it's absorbed and how it's heated, so it helps create that appearance. Oh, I don't have to click it, it's still there. So you've got the nicotine, you've got the propylene glycol, you've got the glycerin, and then you have the flavors. And that's the big appeal for a lot of people. It comes in every different flavor you can imagine, and the flavors they use for the most part are the same sort of artificial flavors that you find in food and drinks. And they're perfectly safe to eat. The problem is that just because they're safe to eat doesn't mean they're safe to inhale. They weren't intended for that purpose, and a number of common flavorings, stuff like some of this common vanilla and strawberry flavorings, can irritate the lungs, cause breathing problems, and with the students, I really try to emphasize, there's so many athletes, when you're in high school, so many students are involved in whether it's basketball or track or softball or football. There's so many options, and every one of them requires running and endurance, and anything that negatively affects your breathing makes it harder to be successful in your sport. And vaping is definitely an example of that. For folks with asthma, it's particularly bad, but anyone who's vaping is going to experience some negative impact to their breathing, and for a lot of teens that's really important because of their commitment to whatever their sport. And I think because it doesn't feel like a cigarette does when you're smoking, sometimes folks assume that it doesn't really affect your lungs, but you're putting a lot of chemicals in there every time you take a puff. There was a few years ago, I'm sure that some folks remember hearing this story, something called popcorn lung. Does anyone remember that? Yeah. So that was in the news quite a bit a few years back. Basically, some years ago, popcorn factory workers started developing this lung disease, and they eventually traced it to a flavoring chemical called diacetyl that was used to make sort of extra buttery flavor. So they stopped using it in popcorn. Years go by, vape companies are looking for a way to make buttered popcorn flavored vapes and e-liquids, so they turn to that same chemical that already been shown to cause this lung disease, but companies are using it anyways, and at that point there's zero regulation on this industry. So you can put anything in the product, you can make it in any setting, any sort of facility, and there's really no no inspections or no guidelines for what you can and can't sell. And that's still somewhat the case. We're going to talk about shortly. But naturally, using this chemical that was causing lung disease before, it started happening again to the folks who were using these vapes with that ingredient in it. And it's just the sort of risk that comes with a product that doesn't have safety regulations, and it's something that you're putting into your lungs, which is a pretty sort of intimate sort of connection in your body, right? And what you put into your lungs is going deep into your body and really throughout. So I know that people have heard of that condition sometimes and are curious, where that came from, what that means. So, that's what popcorn lung was. If it was using that same chemical that caused lung disease in popcorn workers. Beyond just the ingredients that make up those liquids, you have any number of other chemicals that are either coming from different ingredients or are the result of heating up the liquids. Just like when you light a cigarette, it burns the tobacco, creates new chemicals. You have the same sort of process when you heat up these liquids, especially when you have a a stronger battery, something like this or this. Pardon me. So you can hear it's very heavy. You end up with dozens of different chemicals that they can trace in the vapor that people are breathing out. But also, there was a study that came out 2 weeks ago, and there's nonstop research on vaping now. It's become a pretty a pretty major issue in the tobacco research world. And when I come and do a presentation, I always have to check to see if there's any new research out, because it's such a short time frame that they've actually been studying this stuff, that we can really understand things very differently in a short period of time based on the research that's coming out. But yeah, 2 weeks ago, University of California, San Francisco, released a study. They had two groups of teenagers. One group of teenagers vaped, the other group of teenagers did not, and each group submitted urine samples that were analyzed. The group that vaped had dozens of different chemicals in their urine, things that are also found in cigarettes, like formaldehyde, acrolein, things that are connected to cancer. The teens who didn't vape did not have those chemicals in their urine. So beyond just showing that there's chemicals in this stuff, that's actually showing that these chemicals are being inhaled in high enough quantities that they're making it through a person's system, going through their entire body and coming out. And that's a real concern, because that means that folks who vape are exposing themselves to a lot of the same stuff that's in cigarettes. It may not be in the same level, but that doesn't mean it's not enough to cause problems. Okay, so all this says, and I'll just kind of go through it, is that adults who vape almost all of the time are people trying to quit smoking or who've switched from smoking to vaping. For teens, it is kind of the opposite. It's people who are trying these products for the first time. So the health risks, and I just mentioned we don't have a tremendous amount of research on the health risks of vaping because it is so new. We definitely don't have long-term health data because there's really hasn't been a long-term with these products. But in the last few years, research has started to show a number of very serious concerns even before we get that long-term information. Probably the biggest concern, and there have been study after study that shows this, teens who vape are more likely to become cigarette smokers than teens who don't. And at a time when fewer and fewer teens are smoking cigarettes, that's a real concern. The last thing we want to see is a reversal of the trend and more teens starting to smoke cigarettes. And that's the nicotine addiction side of it for me is really where the greatest concern is. Because you can't, if you're using these products, you can't control whether or not you're going to become addicted. Anyone who smokes knows that when you start, you don't think you're going to get hooked on it, and you keep doing it for a while, and you can kind of stop whenever you want. So people have the impression that it's not going to happen to them, and then eventually it does. It happened to me. It happens to pretty much anyone who smokes. Went through some version of that. And for young people who are vaping today, it's the same process. They're not immediately addicted to nicotine, so the concern may not seem real to them. But before they realize it, a lot of them are becoming addicted. Beyond just the nicotine, there are some pretty serious concerns. We've already started to see damage to the immune system from vaping. And there was actually another study that came out 3 weeks ago. It was from England. I can't remember which university. But what they found was that the actual vapor, when people are inhaling it and it condenses in their lungs, it leaves the inside of their lungs with kind of a wet coating, and bacteria are sticking to that more easily, and people who vape are developing pneumonia at higher rates because it's easier for the bacteria in their lungs to take hold. And that's kind of a separate issue from the immune system, which is another way that people are more likely to get sick when they're using these products. We've also started to see damage to the gums and mouth. Of course, with cigarette smoking, oral health is a major concern. And these products, again, are a mixture of different chemicals going in and out of the mouth that's starting to show its kind of wear on people who are regular vapers. We talked about the flavorings that have been linked to lung disease and other lung conditions. Nicotine poisoning, I talked about a little bit, but basically nicotine poisoning was not an issue until vaping became popular. There were maybe 100 or 200 nicotine poisoning ER calls every year. You'd have to smoke a tremendous amount of cigarettes or be a very small child smoking cigarettes to develop nicotine poisoning. With these liquids and the concentrated nicotine that's in here, all it takes is getting it on your skin, or for young children in particular, and pets, drinking some of it. These things are sweet smelling. This is like a Laffy Taffy cherry flavor. That's not sanctioned by the Laffy Taffy company. This is Fruit Loop flavored. So, definitely things that attract the eye of even a young child who might not know at all what they are. And that's where the real concern for nicotine poisoning comes in. So when someone ingests or absorbs too much nicotine, they're going to have elevated heart rate, sweating, nausea, vomiting, sort of disorientation, and it actually can be fatal. For an adult, that's very rare, but they actually see it quite a bit in pets that get into those products. Secondhand vapor, like cigarette smoking, the chemicals that are present in the smoke or in the vapor are there for other people to inhale. They're not in nearly the sort of concentrations that you'd see in cigarette smoke, but in confined spaces, particularly when you're talking about kids, they are exposed to those chemicals. The last thing, I talked about this a bit, the carcinogens, so these cancer-causing chemicals, have been found in different varieties of e-liquids and the vapor they produce. One of the challenges to studying the health effects of vaping is that cigarettes are pretty uniform. There's maybe 15, 20 brands of cigarettes, and they have standards that they have to meet, and they have like more or less the same stuff in them. These products are made by thousands of different companies, sometimes in large manufacturing facilities, sometimes in basements, and the variation from one product to the next is so great that it's tough to really know what's generally in these things. But again, many studies at this point have found very dangerous chemicals in the vapor that people are inhaling. Oh, and this is just a little graphic of the rise in poison control calls for nicotine poisoning since vaping has become popular. As you can see, the early 2010s, it was 271 a year, and a few years ago it was up to around 4,000, and still rising. There's a culture around vaping that is not really a part of cigarette smoking, so kind of a new additional concern for parents. There's vaping magazines, and go when you get home, have your kids show you some Vape Life videos on YouTube. People doing tricks, blowing the vapor, and kind of you'd have to see it, but I encourage you to check it out. You see there's a guy there, obviously, with this huge cloud, they call it. That's a still from a video about vaping competitions, where people who are professional vapers, they're paid by these vape companies to go to events and promote their products, are seeing who can have the biggest cloud, or they get judged on style, and like figure skating, who we were all watching a couple weeks ago. That was not an issue with cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is largely kind of frowned upon. It's not the cool activity that it once was. We don't see people smoking everywhere we go. With vaping, there really is this scene around it, and for some young people, it's an activity. It's a place where they can get involved with friends and hang out and be a part of something. And I think that's very concerning, because it's important to have friends, and it's important to be part of social activities, but you want it to be around healthy things, not something like this. Yeah, Vape Nation. Did I tell you to show you a Vape Nation video? They do all these sorts of tricks, and it's kind of hard to describe, because it's more than like blowing smoke rings, but it's worth looking at. Now, here we've got some different flavors: gummy bear, blue raspberry, cotton candy. We've got something that looks like Sour Patch Kids, like Trix. One that looks like an Ice Age poster. These products obviously aren't geared towards adults. And these aren't the only varieties of these liquids that are available, but they do make a big portion of the market. And if you take a look at some of the products that have been, these are all this stuff came from students at various other school districts, and they're in line with this stuff. It's not tobacco flavor. It's Smurf flavor. I don't know what that is, but and these companies, they do this on purpose. Adults who are current smokers do, sometimes switch to vaping, but other than that, no adult is going to start buying these products. Once you're in your early 20s, if you haven't started smoking or vaping, is very unlikely that you will. These companies know if they want to be successful, they need to get young people interested in their products. And you know, a lot of these things very much appeal to young kids, not just teens. And these companies may not be expecting young children to go out and start vaping, but they definitely want those young children to be interested. And when they get a few years older, to have some curiosity and, you know, the desire to try it. It's not just with the flavors these companies are targeting young people. The advertising, you know, obviously, with the one on the right, is that right? Yeah, the one on the right is, you put it next to, you know, a Call of Duty ad or something along those lines, a video game, and it fits in very well. Obviously, a lot of these products have the, you know, the sex appeal angle, which is not just for, targeting young folks, but sort of one of the oldest tactics there is. And, you know, these are both ads from like trade magazines, like Vaping magazines. That's not where most of the advertising is going to show up, because that's not where teens are, you know, likely, you know, going to be consuming media. It's social media, but it's really the focus for these companies. And when you go on Instagram or you go on Snapchat, any, you know, major vaping company, and probably most of the not major vaping companies, are going to have, you know, very big social media presence, and they're using the same sort of tactics that tobacco companies used for decades and decades. They're just doing it in a different setting now, where their target audience is more likely to see it. Let's say, so in the bottom right, there's that guy with the long beard and tattoos. If you think back to the Marlboro Man, which, you know, ran for decades and decades, you have this rugged, sort of, tough, masculine guy, and the idea is men will see that and think to themselves, even if they don't admit it, I wish I was more like that. And maybe, you know, they can't go get a horse and a cowboy hat. They probably get a cowboy hat, but what they can do is smoke Marlboro cigarettes. Very similar concept, and a lot of the vape companies have similar sort of imagery of a more modern day and a rugged, masculine character using their products. On the flip side, you have the same sort of models that show off sort of the elegant, glamorous side of using these products to young women. And again, the woman on the top right doesn't necessarily look like or dress like a model from a 1980s, you know, Newport ad, but she's serving the same purpose, you know, being that attractive young woman using this product. They use sports promotions, you know, skateboarding, BMX biking. Obviously, the sort of major leagues aren't going to be promoting vaping, but when you're dealing with stuff on a smaller scale, they can find athletes who are willing to basically be sponsored by a vape company. They have contests on social media. You know, share this post so many times, tag your friends, and you can get entered to win. Here it's an Xbox, and for PlayStations and other systems like that. So again, focusing on things they know will catch the attention of teens and young people in general. The advertising seems to work. In green, you've got money spent on vaping advertising. In orange, you have teen vaping, and it's been increasing as more money is spent. Now, it's unfortunate, but that's the reality of tobacco marketing, is that they've gotten pretty good at doing it. So this is just a little slide on vaping and smoking cessation. You may know folks who've switched from cigarettes to vaping. Right now, because it's a very new technology, you can find, and I have listed here, 3 large studies of very much respected tobacco researchers, and you have one study that determined vaping is the best way for people to quit smoking. One study that determined vaping has a negative effect on people's ability to quit smoking, and one study that says it's probably as good as anything that's out there but no better. There's no consensus at this point. If it works for an individual, that's great. They're not designed to help people quit smoking. They can help somebody switch, and if they eventually are able to stop, again, that's fantastic. But that's not what they're designed for. And what we're talking about is teens, and it's really a separate conversation. There's a lot of products that are available, and frankly, there's nothing out there that is a guarantee for people to quit smoking, whether you're vaping or using a patch or taking a prescription. Most people have to try 5+ times before they can actually quit, and vaping doesn't appear to be a sort of miracle cure for smoking. So regulation of these products, I talked a little bit, but basically about 2 years ago, the FDA announced that they were going to be regulating vaping, e-cigarettes as a tobacco product because it have nicotine. And those regulations have rolled out kind of slowly. The dates on here have actually been pushed back. So it's going to be a while still before the facilities where these products are made are tested. Right now, a lot of these companies are kind of operated out of the house, and they don't have any safety regulations. It's going to be a while before warning labels are required on these products, the way cigarettes have. But even when all of these regulations do come to pass, there's a lot of stuff that still isn't controlled. There's no tax on e-cigarettes, e-liquids, and tobacco taxes are one of the main ways that tobacco use rates have reduced over the last 30 or so years. However you may feel about taxes, they're one of the main things that keeps young people from buying tobacco products, because it basically makes it too expensive for young folks to be able to purchase. So advertising, there's no limits on the advertising, and there's no regulation at this point that would do anything about that. No restrictions on the flavors, so all those candy and fruit flavors are still going to be available, for the foreseeable future. There's no requirement that these products be sold behind the counter. Actually, in Michigan, I didn't learn this until recently, but cigarettes are not required to be sold behind the counter. A lot of states have laws that say you have to put cigarettes behind the counter. Michigan doesn't. It's just done that way because the tobacco industry has those big displays that they give the stores, and they're designed to be behind the counter because most states, require it, and it's easier to steal packs of cigarettes if they're not behind the counter. But you can sell tobacco at any place in a store. And with some of these, vaping products, you do see them, next to the candy on the counter, that sort of thing, which is, of course, a concern. Also, indoor vaping isn't restricted by any of these laws. There's the, laws on smoking in restaurants and bars. That doesn't cover vaping. A lot of businesses may pass their own sort of store policy, but there's no state or federal regulation on that. There's quite a few bills in the state legislature right now that address vaping. None of them are likely to pass for a variety of reasons, so we're probably going to continue for at least the next couple of years to have very limited regulations here in the state. This is just a list of some of the things that are pending. There's a bill in the legislature to raise the tobacco purchase age to 21, which some states have done, a lot of cities across the country have done, and that's potentially a way to limit teen vaping, because it is a younger sort of age group that's largely using those products, limiting the ability of older high school students to provide other students with all that stuff is a potential way to deal with that, but that's also unlikely, almost completely unlikely to happen anytime soon here in Michigan. Like I said, other states have done it. So, liquid synthetic drugs, there are other things you can put in these devices. These you don't see too much anymore, thankfully. There was a big boom a few years ago. They were selling it at party stores and over the counter, and the state passed some laws that got the stuff off the shelves, and now it is a lot harder to get. And when the supply dried up, largely people lost interest in these things. It was no longer a quick, easy way to get high. Now, typically you'd have to order it over the internet, things like that. But there is the potential to use these things in some of these devices, and to look at it, you don't necessarily know what this is filled with. But if someone was using any of these synthetic drugs, the effects are pretty severe. It would never be mistaken for just nicotine. Like these products, there's all sorts of different stuff that could be in any of those. But there were cases at schools around the area of students having seizures and hallucinations, and passing out. So these things are kind of a mixed bag. You don't really know what the effects are going to be because there's all different sorts of chemicals that might be in there. But something to be aware of. More common than that, you'll see marijuana being vaped. There are some of these devices that can either be used with like marijuana oils, or be kind of modified slightly to be used with those products. But the vaporizers designed for marijuana are in the same price range, at least starting, as these devices, and they're just as easy to get. So a lot of folks would be more likely to use something that's designed specifically for marijuana. Again, it can be hard to tell what's in something. Obviously, a person's behavior would be an indicator, but for these devices, they have this the tank that you fill up with liquid. A lot of the THC oils, the marijuana oils, will come in a cartridge that's pre-filled that sort of screws into a battery like this. There's a brand of them. They come from the medical marijuana dispensaries. Basically, people get large quantities of them and sell them. There's a brand that's pretty common called the Clear, and it's written on the cartridge, so that'd be one way to tell. But a lot of times, if there's a question about what's in there, it really has to be tested by the police, because they have the equipment to to detect if there's THC in there. Smell is minimal with the marijuana vaping. Come back to that, but the way that a lot of them work is you have this marijuana concentrate that's maybe anywhere from 60, 70, 80% THC, so the active ingredient, compared to dry marijuana that's maybe 5, 10, 20, 25 if it's like very expensive stuff. And you put that concentrate on this open coil, so there's not a tank for liquid. You just kind of smear it on there, and that coil heats up the concentrate till the point where it vaporizes, and you get, basically it's smoke, it's kind of the same deal. It just heats up enough that the sort of liquid parts of it vaporize, and it doesn't burn. So there's not much smell, because that's where the smell comes from. Some of the concentrates, if you were to put your nose up to it and smell, you could smell marijuana, but some you really can't. Some come in flavors, a lot like these e-liquids, so that really covers up the marijuana smell. And there are some of these devices that are designed for vaporizing dry marijuana. Even with those, because it's not burning, it's just heating up enough to sort of release the THC, you don't get much of a smell from it. So it's tough to tell. Really with all this stuff, the best way to know anything is talking. It's not always the easiest way, and certainly sometimes it's the hardest, but a lot of, if you want to get to the bottom of a lot of this stuff, it really takes, just talking to the individual team. But, the marijuana concentrates are drastically stronger than dry marijuana. Panic attacks, paranoia, hallucinations, people have negative reactions pretty often when they're using a much stronger concentration of THC than what they're used to. You see it a lot in people who eat the edibles, so brownies or cookies with marijuana baked into them. Basically they take too much because they don't know how it's going to affect them, and there's been a spike in marijuana emergency room calls, and it's oftentimes from people who are using those very high potency types of marijuana. And when you're vaping, oftentimes that is the sort of marijuana that's being used. Then we've just got a couple pictures of different types of those concentrates. There's the oil shatter, which is kind of like a plastic-like, and wax, which is sort of soft stuff you can kind of smear around. They're just sort of different methods of extracting the THC from the marijuana that produce the different forms of that. But all those things are very high potency, and even a little bit can be more than a person anticipated. So that's what I've got. There's I always put a plug in for the Michigan Tobacco Quit Line. If anyone is a smoker who's thinking about quitting, or as a friend or family member, the Michigan Tobacco Quit Line is a free service that the state operates. They offer coaching. You get 4 phone calls with a trained coach who sort of talks you through the quit process. And for uninsured folks or people on Medicare, they can also get you free nicotine gum, patch, things like that. I've referred a lot of people to that. It wasn't around when I quit smoking, but some folks are very, very happy with the service they get through that, and it is free, so it's an easy number to remember. Quit now. I always throw that out there, but I appreciate your time, folks. I don't know if there's any questions or anything. We've got all these little devices and liquids and stuff up here, so I'd encourage you to check them out. And if you have any questions, I'll be here. So, please. Thank you.